Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming tonight. For those of you who may not know, the Honorable Phil Campbell is currently the two-term mayor of Howell, Michigan, and candidate for state representative in the 47th District here in Michigan. He is also a teacher in his professional life, and will be speaking to us tonight about educational philosophy. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mr. Campbell for most of my young adult life. He was the director of the youth group at my church, as well as one of my professors in high school, easily my favorite. I remember working with him on his last campaign before I left to come here for school and seeing the way that people responded to his values and the principles that he was inspiring. Since my graduation, we've stayed in touch, going out to lunch when I go home, talking about our plans and our aspirations. Even as an adult, I have frequently called him a mentor to me, as have others who have known him. The last time I was back home, we took a walk on some state land and ended up lasting the better part of a day, crossing streams and fields totally lost in conversation until we ended up miles away from our destination. It was a very pleasant memory and a demonstration of Mr. Campbell's passion for life and the kind of energy that he brings to every job or task he does, especially in the realm of politics, where there is great need for revitalization. Philip was born and raised in Howell, Michigan. He graduated from Howell High School, holds his degrees in liberal arts and education from Ave Maria University and Madonna University. He has taught high school and middle school social studies in the private schools for most of his adult life. At 31, he was elected the youngest mayor in the history of his city, defeating a 12-year incumbent, and was re-elected unopposed in 2013. He is currently a candidate for state representative in the 47th District, and it is now my honor to present the Honorable Mayor Philip Campbell.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's so wonderful to be here talking to students. I talk to students all the time in my professional life, and I love it. Students are often the only people whose minds have not yet been stiffened by the stultifying rigidity that comes with the onset of adulthood. And many of you out there I see are my former students, so it's especially wonderful to see you here. And although those of you who are my former students have heard me talk many, many times before, it's not often that I've got to talk to you about any subject that I want. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about education itself, which is the one thing that I and you, my former students, share in common in our relationship. I originally titled this talk, Education, Truth in a State of Transmission, which is a quote from the early 20th century British author G.K. Chesterton. And in examining what's gone wrong with education in this country and highlighting the importance of educational philosophy, I'd like to open with another quote from Chesterton, who so marvelously describes the problem with many modern ideologies. He says, quote, "Suppose a great commotion arises in the street about something, let us say a lamppost, which many influential persons in the community desire to pull down. A gray-clad monk, who is the spirit of the Middle Ages, is approached upon the matter and begins to say, 'Let us first of all consider, my brethren, the value of light. If light be in itself good.'" Now at this point, he's somewhat excusably knocked down. All of the people make a mad rush for the lamppost. The lamppost is down in 10 minutes, and they go about congratulating each other on their practicality. But as things go on, they do not work out so easily. Some people have pulled the lamppost down because they wanted electric light, some because they wanted old iron, some because they wanted darkness, because their deeds were evil. Some thought it was not enough of a lamppost, some thought it was too much of a lamppost. Some acted because they wanted to smash municipal machinery, some acted because they wanted to smash something. And there was war in the night, no man knowing whom he strikes. So gradually, inevitably, today, tomorrow, or the next day, there comes back the conviction that the monk was right all along. It all depends on your philosophy of light. Only what we might have discussed under the light, now we must discuss in the darkness. End quote. So, we don't know where we're going. I think that applies to education. Everybody knows that education in this country is not where it needs to be, but where should it be going? And I think that depends on our philosophy of education. As a teacher for most of my adult life in the private schools, homeschooling, doing various short-term assignments in public school, I've reflected on this often, on where education needs to be going, and come up with the idea that I think the fundamental problem in education in this country is that our approach to it from both ends of the political spectrum tend to be too mechanistic, viewing education almost as a sort of industrial system, that you can just tweak something here, change something there, and if you make the right adjustments in the right places, everything will just kind of hum along flawlessly into the future, as if it was some sort of manufacturing process. I want to posit something revolutionary, that maybe education is not a mechanical system. Maybe it's a human system, with all the marvelous variability that that entails. I believe the core root of our educational problem is a failure to understand, to really, not just understand with the mind, but to really take to heart the fact that the subjects of education are human persons and not cogs in a great machine. Sure, if you ask someone, are students cogs or persons, they will say, of course, they're persons. But I think we haven't sufficiently reflected on what this really entails. In other words, it's not fundamentally a money problem. It's not about class size. The U.S. spends more money on education than most other countries. Class sizes are smaller than in most other countries, despite what you hear to the contrary. Yet our problems continue. This is because all our efforts are consistently going in the wrong direction, because we need to change our philosophy. What is our philosophy of education? This is where it starts. It starts up here. So what do I mean when I say education is a human system, that human persons are the real subjects of education? First, and this is a very simple fact but often misunderstood, education is ultimately about what is being learned, not about what is being taught. If you say, what's the difference? I'll show you, because they're not the same thing. You can have an awful lot of teaching going on and very little learning. Who's ever been in a class where there's a lot of teaching but very little learning going on? Okay, every hand's going up. You can have legislation stipulating what content shall be taught. You can have programs at colleges of education dictating methodologies for teaching. You can have money for policies making teachers more accountable, but none of it matters if the students are not learning. Heck, there's all sorts of teaching going on all over the place, but not a lot of learning. So it is my belief that we have a culture of education in this country that contradicts or stifles some of the most basic principles upon which education flourishes. Let us examine some of these first principles that we ought to bring to education in order to prevent learning from being suffocated beneath a stifling educational bureaucracy. First, let's recall that children are fundamentally, naturally, inherently different. Really recognize this and ask, does our system respect and foster the natural differences inherent in children? Humans are diverse with various interests, strengths, weaknesses, time frames of development, manners of learning. An education that is person-centered will respect these diversities and attempt to accentuate and work with them rather than smoothing them out. Now, unfortunately, and I've seen it all over the place, our system does not reflect this variability. Since the Cold War, the emphasis in America has been basically on math and science. And the prevailing methodology in most secondary schools is to keep kids occupied doing mind-numbing busy work with the aim of producing conformity to standards as reflected in a standardized test. We presume everyone should proceed at the same pace, learn the same subject matter, be tested by the same standards. Meanwhile, as many as 10% of American children are diagnosed with ADHD. Without speculating on the causes and the complexities of that crisis, could it possibly be due to the fact that kids naturally resist doing what has been called low-grade clerical work most of the day? Are we surprised that they start to fidget? How about recognizing the value of children's curiosity? Children are naturally curious. And valuing teachers who can engage that curiosity. A school is ultimately only as good as its teachers. Doesn't matter what facilities it has, doesn't matter whether it's in a good town or a poorer town. It's ultimately about the teachers. Democrats and Republicans alike need to recall that teaching is a creative profession, not a mere delivery system. And what do I mean by that, creative profession? That a teacher is more akin to an artist or a performer. Great teachers do more than just facilitate the transfer of information. A teacher should be a mentor. They should stimulate, provoke thought, be engaging, and this cannot be taught in a college of education, but this is in fact what makes learning possible. Unfortunately, our dominant educational culture focuses on testing, not on learning. Testing should not be the dominant culture, and our system will not be any better off until we move away from the tyranny of a standardized test. Should we have tests? Absolutely. I'm a teacher. I give tests all the time. Every Friday, my kids have a test, right? But they should not dominate our thinking, much less our funding. Tests are meant to be diagnostic, evaluative. They provide a thermometer to tell you how your students are doing. They are not the hinge upon which the whole system rotates. Tests should support, not obstruct education. Unfortunately, we have a culture that promotes compliance rather than curiosity. The No Child Left Behind legislation, as well as President Obama's Common Core initiative, both of these strengthen the hold of standardized testing on our system and promote a vision that's more about compliance with bureaucratically designed methodologies than real education. And that this comes from both sides of the aisle at times reflects the difficulty our leaders have of breaking out of the dominant paradigm. Finally, we need to affirm the innate creativity of human life. Creativity is part of the common heritage of a human being, and education should awaken these powers of creativity. Yes, there's going to be information and tests and things like that in school, but ultimately, education should not be about teaching children what to think. It should be about forming them how to think. That is what education is. Teachers are integral in this role, and this is why liberal arts are so important, because they teach you how to think. Modern educational theories have told us that the teacher is dispensable, that teachers should become coaches who simply facilitate a child teaching himself. I just spoke to a teacher just tonight on my way here who told me that at his school he was corrected by the principal for teaching too much, that he should back off and let the kids do more group work, educate themselves, and that he should just back off and be a coach to facilitate the learning. Now, that was in a private school, so this is endemic everywhere. It's not just a public problem. This is off the mark. Teachers are not simply coaches. Just as it would be off the mark to say a teacher simply puts information into a bucket, that's wrong as well. Education is not about filling an empty bucket with facts. It's not about standing back and waiting for a child to sprout on his own like a tomato plant. Education is about lighting a fire. And once it's caught, it burns of its own accord, but it will never burn if it's not lit. How can we light it? How can we foster creativity rather than uniformity? There's success stories out there. Many of you are success stories, but we have to admit they're happening in spite of the dominant culture, not because of it. Yes, I know we have funding issues we need to solve. I know we have labor problems to work out, debt problems, I know. But first and foremost, we need to change the culture. And I propose 8 philosophical shifts that need to happen to get us going in the right direction, and most of these can be adopted locally. So 8 philosophical shifts that we should facilitate in our approach to education. Number 1, let's go back to the fundamental relationship of teachers in the classroom with their students. That relationship ought to be the starting point and ending point of every policy discussion. Does it help or hinder teachers? Too long have policymakers been tinkering around with legislation with no idea of how it actually affects teachers on the job in the classroom. The integrity of the teacher-student relationship in conjunction with the parents ought to be prioritized without the state, the district, the union, or whomever interposing themselves within that relationship. Let's keep things between teachers, students, and parents. That's where education happens. Number 2, adopt a broad-based classical curriculum. Math and science are important, but they are not central. We especially need to nourish the humanities, art, literature, and music. And by the way, these are especially endangered in the new Common Core standards. Why are these important? These are integral to the formation of well-rounded individuals because they speak to parts of the human person that are otherwise left untouched. We need to return to the classical approach and break our focus on math. Now, for those students who are inclined to math, science, and engineering, we certainly can have more opportunities for applied math, applied engineering, and things like that. But let us give equal precedence to the arts, literature, and music, which do not simply impart knowledge, but form character, which is an aspect of education that's totally forgotten about these days. Number 3, prioritize individualized instruction. The most successful and enduring educational model in the history of the human race is what? Anybody want to guess? The most successful and enduring educational model in the history of the world is the master-disciple relationship. It goes all the way back to the ancient world. Why? Because it's the most individualized. Now, it's not necessarily going to be something you can implement in the modern system, but we need to encourage teachers and districts to find innovative ways to individualize their instruction and cut the bureaucratic red tape necessary to free up time for them to do so. Mass-produced education has not worked. It will never work because people are individuals and they're not cogs in a system. So when we're in that classroom, we need to look at ways at how our instruction can be individualized. Number 4, rethink how and why children advance through school. And what I mean by that is this, that currently what grade a child is in is largely connected with your age. If you're 12 or 13, you ought to be in 7th grade, for example. Now, I think we're all in agreement that there should be broad guidelines for what children should know by certain ages. But our current system of uniform age-based grade advancement really does not allow for the variability of human development. An example that we all recognize, potty training. Now, you have to have this done by the time you get into school. So no, but potty training is a classic example. People always say, I'm a parent of 4, and we're always talking about this. Oh, my kid potty trained at 1.5. Mine, it took till they were 3. You know, all different times that this happens. The understanding is that the child develops the skill when he is ready. Now, the same is true with academics to a certain degree. My firstborn child learned to read at age 3. My secondborn learned to read at age 6. So what? So what? They both can read now. Why can't we have a system where a child's grade is not predicated of their age, but their proficiency in a given discipline? For example, why can't we have an 11-year-old who is in grade 5 math, grade 7 history and science, and grade 6 writing, all simultaneously? It would respect the variability of the child's interests and development, increase age diversity in the classroom, and remove the stigma of being in remedial math, like I was, or being held back, right? This idea has its limits, of course, but I think applied prudently, it allows much more flexibility. Unfortunately, we are moving in the other direction. New proposed Michigan legislation, which I disagree with, mandates that children would be held back if they're not proficient in reading by 3rd grade. If we didn't have an age-based advancement system, these children could proceed to 4th grade in other subjects if they're proficient and get help only in the subjects that they need it in. So I think we should revisit the rationale for why we tie grade advancement to age and consider diversifying this. Number 5, attribute higher status to the teaching profession and understand that education is a real investment. We really need to encourage mentoring programs in the school districts, programs that districts create and implement themselves for new teachers having opportunities to learn from seasoned pros. In Michigan, over 50% of teachers quit after the 2nd year. It's an extremely high turnover. We need to rework current policies that allow a disproportionate amount of work to be placed on teachers with low seniority. That's why the turnover is so high. I was offered jobs before in schools where they wanted me because I looked good on paper, but they said, you also have to coach, you have to take on 1 AP class. And you know, for a first-year teacher who's just getting used to things like that, managing 100 kids a day, you know, taking on coaching and AP and things like that, it burns you out quick. And they get loaded up with that because they're low on the seniority. That needs to stop. And don't tell me, please, sorry, this is a pet peeve, do not tell me that teachers don't work or don't earn it. We manage over 100 kids a day, 5 days a week. All the baggage every single kid brings from home becomes my problem. We spend our lunches correcting papers, evenings preparing assignments, often staying only a day ahead of things. We go to bed at midnight and get up at 6, spend half our summer getting ready for the next year, and paradoxically, when we take time off, the work piles up. We don't get less work for taking time off, we get more. So don't tell me that teachers don't work. So I would say number 5, value the teacher. It's a philosophical shift. Number 6, and I think this is one of the most important things, devolve responsibility for education to the school level to get things done. Education does not happen in committee rooms in the state legislature. It happens in schools. And if you remove their discretion, it stops working. Bring these decisions back to the people on the ground, the ones closest to the problems who know how to handle them. Local control. If one district wants to say we want to experiment with a liberal arts curriculum centered on the classics and on music, why can't they? If another one wants to say we want to prioritize math and science and engineering, why can't they? Why can't we do this? I know teachers, because of the red tape, they're so busy filling out mandatory paperwork that they need student aides to grade their homework for them. No wonder things are in such a mess. So devolve responsibility to the local level. Number 7, and students will appreciate this one. Less time in class, more time on task. And what is this? Well, both ends of the spectrum tend to suffer from a purely quantitative approach to education. If standardized test scores are bad, more school is the answer. Either a longer class day, a shorter summer break, or starting school at age 3, as has recently been proposed in the state of Michigan. As if physically putting children in the building for longer periods of time will solve the problem. If 1,093 hours, which is the average time a Michigan student spends in school, aren't enough, adding a few more hours isn't going to fix the problem. It's not a quantitative problem. It's a qualitative problem. The average teacher in a 55-minute class spends only 25 minutes on instruction. What is the rest of the time spent doing? 30 minutes on classroom management and given instructions. All right, sit down, sit down, sit down. All right, hey, sit down. Quiet. You over there. Quiet. Hey, okay. Where do we put our papers? Okay, I already said. Where do we put our papers? I just explained it. Put them right here. Can I go to the bathroom? Okay. That's the sort of stuff that most of the class time gets eaten up with. More structured breaks with more physical education integrated into the day. I recently heard a story of an American teacher on a visit to a Finnish school. The Finnish classes in Finland, they're punctuated by half-hour breaks throughout the day. And the American teacher marveled and said, how do you get any teaching done with all these breaks? And the Finnish teacher said, if it wasn't for all these breaks, I wouldn't get any teaching done, right? Less time actually sitting in the classroom, more of an integration between physical activity and seminar, and the time on task is more valuable. Right? You can get more done in 20 minutes if it's on task than 55 minutes when it's not. And finally, number 8, find creative ways to engage parents in the work of teachers, since we all know across every demographic, parental involvement is the #1 predictor of educational success across every demographic. If we know that, why are we moving in a direction that increasingly pushes parents out of the educational process? Again, devolve responsibility for this to the school or district level. The solutions are all local. They're all up here. We just have to change our thinking and act on it. It's not the state that's going to change things. Certainly the federal government is going to fix it. So to wrap this up, education is a system about people. It's not just a process. And I speak this from my heart as the fruit of many years meditating on this problem. Education is a human system, and in a human system there's conditions under which people thrive and conditions under which they don't. Learning is an organic thing. It happens if the conditions are right. So the real role of legislators, the real role of educational leadership is not just top-down mechanistic command and control. It ought to be creating a climate of possibility, encouraging the right philosophical framework. Chesterton said that education is truth in a state of transmission. That does not require huge bureaucracies and billions of dollars. It simply requires a shift in ideas and the necessary elbow room for schools and local governments to let those ideas flourish and bear fruit. So let's do that, and let's see where we end up. Thank you.
We will now open the floor to questions and answers. I think Daniel already told you we don't have actually an empty mic, so just ask your questions straight up, and Mr. Campbell will repeat them.
Do you think then that class time should be shorter than that we should cut down on the amount of time children are spending in the classroom?
Yeah, the question whether students spend too much time in individual classes. This has been debated. 55 minutes has been the standard. I think 55 minutes is good as long as they're not stacked in 3 or 4 or 5 hours long. Kids are naturally fidgety, even high school kids, believe it or not. So, I would value 55 minutes if the students were entirely focused and had their energy out, rather than having to waste 20 or 30 minutes getting them under control and putting out fires in the classroom. So I think 55 minutes is sufficient, but instead of that 1 half-hour break in the middle, I would punctuate that with further breaks, but structured breaks where there's some sort of structured or physical activity going on. Not just, I'm not talking about more breaks where they just mope around, the hallway gossiping, structured physical stuff to get the energy out. I think that would be more productive. Mm-hmm.
Education in terms of college level.
Yeah.
And the question of liberal arts, that we pose on liberal arts people, we're all liberal arts students here, is what about getting a job after college? How much prudential, pragmatic factor goes into liberal arts education?
The reason liberal arts colleges are so popular is ironically because we failed at the high school level. For most of Western tradition, liberal arts have been taught at the high school level. When you're in high school is when you should be studying liberal arts, and then when you get to college, that should be the time for vocational training. Now, because most of what's going on in high school is not filling the need, a lot of liberal arts colleges are popping up kind of in an educational supply and demand sort of situation to fill that demand for liberal arts. But the consequence of that is that people come out of college with a liberal arts degree that might not suit them for the job market. So I think a lot of these problems are connected. Liberal arts needs to happen in high school. And then when you get to college, that should be the time for your vocational training. I know it's all backwards now, but unfortunately sometimes the only thing you can say about a problem is we never should have gotten into the problem to begin with. And that's the situation we're in now. So I would say anything that fosters liberal arts in high school, and many of you know it, you're here at a liberal arts college, you took liberal arts in high school and then you got to college and you took the same thing again because the colleges are doing what the high schools ought to have been doing. So I would say that college should be focused on the vocational, and not on the liberal arts. This is what you should have been learning in high school.
One more question?
Yes, ma'am. That would be a really great idea, and I know that AP doesn't solely focus on math and science. You'll have AP U.S. history, AP literature, and things like that. But yeah, AP, a lot of it is tied to just government standardized testing. That's why AP is so popular, because if you pass this AP test, you get a college credit and whatnot. So I think what you're suggesting is a good thing. I have no objection to AP or IP classes whatsoever. What I object to is first-year teachers being loaded up with these classes, which are way more burdensome than a regular class, because the teachers with the higher seniority don't feel like they should have to take on that workload. So as long as that problem is solved, a greater distribution of the AP and IP would be a wonderful thing. Anything to introduce that diversity in there would be good, so I agree with you. Thank you.